Josh Brown, Sony have lost $10 billion off their stock price with apparently a decade-low margin for video game sales, according to CNBC. This comes after a recent Sony finance call revealed the company will miss their console sales targets by about 4 million units, projected to be 21 million at the end of March versus the 25 million that they were aiming for by the end of the financial year. Equity analyst Atul Goyal noted that compared to the same period last year, Sony's operating margins are halved from 12 to 13% down to about 6%. Goyal said their revenue on digital sales, add-on content, digital downloads are at all-time highs, and yet their margins are at decade lows. This is just not acceptable. There's more to this overall, and I think the conversation ends up going towards the idea of how much the average Sony AAA game is costing, and there's more quotes in here, but immediate thoughts?
Lots to pick apart, to be honest, because, it's interesting that this is happening to Sony, who over the past few months, as you mentioned, the discussion has all been around their budget sizes and how much something like Spider-Man 2 costs to make, how much money you sink into a project like The Last of Us Factions and then ultimately cancel. Do you have enough money for the acquisitions to keep up with Microsoft? Stuff like that. And I do think there is something to be said about Sony and what they are pumping their money into and their investments. However, I also think there's something to be said about just the general financial climate as a whole and how that impacts companies and how I think companies are not responding to just how the world is right now. I woke up on Friday to the news that the UK is once again in a recession.
Did we ever get out of one?
Did we ever get out of one? For the second time in my lifetime, you know what I mean? The second time in 15 years or whatever. So I think there's much to consider about why these margins are so tight and why this is a perceived loss of money, but I worry that a lot of these companies are just kind of ignorant to the market right now because they're still spending and they're still expecting COVID revenue, right? Where everyone is indoors and playing games, yet we're out of that now. That bubble itself has burst, and also the financial security of many countries around the world have burst at the same time.
Especially in gaming, there were so many targets set and so many acquisitions made during the pandemic. Something that came out of the Game Developers Conference was that just nobody is buying up games right now. It's very, very hard to get your game signed by a publisher, as trying to read the terrain for the rest of the year is notably hard. I did throw in here, though, that all of this stuff comes after Sony's own financial call happened with interim CEO Hiroki Totoki. He's the dude that's replaced Jim Ryan for now, saying that since he's taken the position, he has visited a ton of studios, and he does note that there's a core problem with Sony as an organization. He says people who work in the studios have very high motivation, they're very highly motivated, they're very good people, and they have great creative minds and knowledge of live streaming. When it comes to the business, though, I think there is room for improvement, and that's to do with how to use money, the schedule of development, and how to fulfill one's accountability towards development. Those are my frank impressions. Also included in that financial call was Sony saying that they don't have any major releases between now and the end of March next year, the next financial year, which will be March 31st, 2025, which I've put down here is like making a lot of analysts and fans wonder what the hell's going to be in Sony's year for the rest of the year. Yes, Helldivers 2 is blowing the F up and it's phenomenal, and you've got Rise of the Ronin and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth as third-party exclusives, but in terms of first-party stuff, Totoki also mentioned that, for the next year, they're kind of just going to be focusing on live service stuff. So you do have Helldivers 2, you have Foam Stars already out, Concord is apparently later this year, and we had Jeff Grubb, known leaker Jeff Grubb, dive in there and say that there is apparently a new Astro Bot game coming as well this year, which is awesome. Astro Bot's like the best PS5 game, to be honest. So that's cool. There's a little bit more here too in regards to this stuff, but thoughts on the shenanigans?
I always worry when an executive of this level, goes to a studio and says, well, they're good creatively, but they're just not good at the business. Because the optimist in me thinks that means more efficient production pipelines. I had recently watched The Last of Us 2 Grounded documentary, which is a really interesting insight behind the scenes of that game. And there's a interesting moment towards the beginning where Neil Druckmann sits down all of the Naughty Dog, I imagine, team leads and says, this is going to be the smoothest production we've ever had. We've got a plan. We're going to smash it. Spoiler alert, they did not smash it. The game was delayed, and it led to a bunch of turnaround in the staff, people leaving, stuff like that. And then at the end of the documentary, they say, all right, we messed up, but we're going to do it properly this time. We've brought in producers, we've changed out some managers, we're not necessarily making creatives be managers, putting a lot of things in to streamline that production, which, in an ideal world would save money. I worry that the interim CEO does not view the these as adequate business moves and will, unfortunately, I worry, be looking towards those margins, be looking towards reducing headcount, as they like to say in the industry, and kind of follow suit in that regard and try to maximize profits through microtransactions and, you know, live services, and capitalize on that area rather than allowing these teams to continue to cultivate creativity, but just sort of making that process smoother. I wish the focus was there, and I don't see evidence that it is right now.
That's kind of the overall question that I want to posit: is the you know, the AAA PS5 exclusive, is that general level of production kind of dead? If you take it as the Last of Us 2, like that whole thing that came out of the Grounded documentary is that idea of you have a bunch of some of the best, most talented creatives in the world working together in one studio, and them saying in the documentary, you know, like, if you give us enough time, we'll keep going, we'll keep expanding, and you end up with a big, like, the game's like 40 hours long. I remember Last of Us 2 being a really meaty thing, and that potentially being a problem if you start getting all statistical about it. And at the same time, that then is the conversation. Is that what people want from PlayStation exclusives? Do they also try and hit that bar? Or is something more like a Helldivers 2 a more common thing to do? Like, the two big success stories of the year are Helldivers 2 and Palworld. Like, there's the price side of that, which I was going to mention when you said about the state of the economy. People can more easily afford a £40, £35 game versus a £70 one, especially if that £70 one is buggy or whatever it is. So there's that side of it, but there's also that assumption of what Sony first party even is. And Totoki's saying that across the rest of this year into next year, they're going to focus on live services. There's a doom and gloom version of that where they realize that's where all the money is, and they never do something. I mean, Naughty Dog have said they're doing it in The Last of Us, but they don't make that the norm. Naughty Dog are, by their own admission, an anomaly in the first party landscape. But we do also have consultancy firm Kantan Games CEO Serkan Toto saying, in regards to games like Spider-Man 2 costing $300 million to make, these budgets seem to have a significant impact on their gaming margins over time. And we also have, back to the Sony finance call, Vice President Naomi Matsuoka saying that they expect the annual sales pace of the PS5 hardware to start falling from the next fiscal year. So I was just, overall, it's that idea of like the PS5 boom, the PS4 first party stuff, that whole era. Is that coming to an end?
I think... Oh, man, it might be right. It really might be. They might not be satisfied. They might want to make more money. They might want to pivot. My question always is, how much money do they want to make? You know what I mean? We're reeling off these numbers.
You can just ask that to the West.
Yeah, that's
the
true,
Western world.
We're reeling off all of these numbers, rightly so, because this is what the analysts are looking at. This is what the CEOs are looking at. But it's important to note that Sony lost that $10 billion in market share, but it's not losing money from the PlayStation side of things. Like, it's the margins might be slimmer, but it's still making money. It's still making a lot of money. You can look at the sales of the PlayStation 5 and say that they're, you know, maybe trailing off, but it's still doing just as good as the PlayStation 4 after a chip shortage. You can say that, you know, Insomniac had a $300 million budget for Spider-Man 2. Absolutely right. That thing still sold 10 million copies and counting. We know it's well beyond its break-even point. We know that is now going to be making profit for the company. And it's always a case of what is the reality here? Like, what is the profit margin that you would be satisfied with? And is it worth completely changing what you do or pivoting from what you're doing now to make that profit margin go up by 4%, which is kind of what they're maybe looking for,
right?
It's
like single digits.
Yeah, like I know what I'm questioning right now is capitalism, but I gotta question it because it raises questions of, I think, what do you want out of the industry? Do you want to continue to create a brand that people respect and gravitate towards, or do you want, more importantly, that 4%? Are you trying to get that more over everything else?
Which is also like, if you think of it like industry-wide, you look at Nintendo's approach. Like, the next game they've got coming out is the Princess Peach game, which is a 2D side-scroller, assumedly something that is very much in their wheelhouse and didn't cost the earth to make. They will still charge a premium price point for that and make a lot of money for it. On the Xbox side, we had the Xbox conference live stream podcast thing last week, you know, saying that going forward, they're going to have as many screens will be Xboxes as possible. That's their general approach to things. things, get Game Pass out there on streaming, make sure you've got Game Pass on your console, and make that service available to as many developers as possible. The thing that didn't get talked about in that, and they wouldn't necessarily address it there, is how big of a production can you afford in-house when your main revenue maker is a monthly subscription model. Like, you're not charging £70 or $70 per entry fee to those things. There is some of them, like some games that get on Game Pass, you can buy them separately, but that's their approach to this, and just get as many game ideas out there as possible. And they even mentioned, Sarah Bond in that podcast even mentioned Palworld as a great success. And it's like, you guys just had that.
Yeah.
What would you have if you didn't have Palworld? But it still proved that model worked. And I think that's that big conversation, which I've rabbited on so much about what is the sort of optimum game experience. And looking at something like Helldivers, and like, to me, it's only me, that's enough visual fidelity, if that is where most of the money is going. And it's too easy to boil it down to like, well, too many cinematically focused games are focusing too much on cutscenes, and like pupils dilate when the room is lighter or whatever, or darker. There's that whole conversation about like, does the average person even notice that stuff, and could you cut it out, and could you reduce the scope down and get more games out there and whatever? Because that was what the industry was like across the 2000s. Because there's the amount of money being put into them, it was less, and more ideas were being greenlit, etc. That Xbox approach is get as many games out there as possible. However, because even Xbox themselves, they talk about their Game Pass numbers, but they're combining Xbox Live numbers with Game Pass signups. There's a whole thing. It's just interesting right now hearing the Sony side, and there's the potential that their AAA stuff is also unfeasible, which is what Sony president Sean Layden is also saying.
Yeah.
Like I said, maybe that era, we're glad to get Red Dead 2s, we're glad to get Last of Us 2s, but they are anomalies.
Oh,
and maybe that's
they
sad,
aren't, man. Going forwards, I think it is sad. I think it's incredibly valid to criticize Sony's approach in what you were saying there. Really focusing on that scale of production above all else. I think, like you mentioned, Helldivers and Palworld, they've all proven that you can sell millions and millions of copies of a game if it doesn't have ear cartilage effects that you find in The Last of Us. That said, I think, like,
Still took 7 years to make.
It still took 8 years to make. It was still a long time. It was blood, sweat, and tears. It was a lot of graft. There was a lot of money still pumped into it. Just admittedly, probably not the same as a rock star would spend on the next Grand Theft Auto. But I think, as always, the approach is all of these things side by side. Like, I love the fact that Helldivers is doing so well, that you've been jumping on it with pretty much everyone in the office.
It rules.
Having a fun time. I've loved the clips that have come from that. I love the success for that studio. And I think it's quite a good template for Sony to base their live services on going forward, because as far as I can tell, you'll be able to correct me, it doesn't seem all that predatory in terms of what it is monetizing in game. Of course, it's not free to play, so you wouldn't necessarily expect that anyway. It does demand money from you up front, but it's reasonably priced. Like you said, it's quote unquote smaller compared to the AAA experiences, and people have loved it. I think that being the template for Sony's live service approach fits way more than trying to take a Naughty Dog or a Guerrilla and telling them to take this franchise that everyone loves and make it a live service. I think that's where issues have cropped up over the past few years, so I hope they take the right lessons from Helldivers. And I hope we get to like a future where, these budgets are scaled back. A game like Spider-Man 2 probably shouldn't cost $300 million, right? Like, that is an outrageous margin for error going forward. But I would still love to see the real attention to detail that Naughty Dog was afforded in The Last of Us 2, which is shown off in that Grounded 2 documentary of, people being able to spend so much time on clothing references or blood splatter references to get every detail right, alongside the likes of something as immediately fun as Helldivers, which has this, really thought out meta-narrative and, just like really gameplay focused and gameplay first experiences. I think the future is in a combination rather than trying to bet it all on these $300 million games.
Yeah, which that'll be the conversation. What does Sony want their first party identity to be? Because they only became the big story focused titan of the industry through the 2 generations ago, with The Last of Us, like originally in 2013, and then going from there, and then Last of Us seeing their first party. God of War's reboot is a Last of Us thing of that franchise. But it's interesting looking at the way technology's gone, the amount of even things like the geography of where those studios are located, like trying to make those things work so that the people who are working on them, who, like I said, are some of the most talented people on earth, get paid appropriately or not given the appropriate amount of hours to put these games together. It's interesting looking at Sony pivoting in real time across the last couple of years as well, where they did remake The Last of Us 1. Like, that had more done to it than something like the Tomb Raider remaster. But then to ostensibly re-release The Last of Us Part 2 with a higher resolution, they weren't remaking assets in that game to get more money out of that base project that's been done. Like, to make a specific comparison, this particular thing that we're filming right now will also be an audio podcast that's available on the podcast feed. And that can help you get more money out of the original source thing that you're putting together. I see Sony trying to make that work on a way bigger scale.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that's the way that you make those big games make sense. But it's also interesting, and it's not to talk about the Insomniac leak in too much detail, but like the amount of things that came out last year about them, their overall roadmap, is that also what makes things sustainable? Like the amount of Marvel games that are coming that are now assigned to Insomniac, or just trying to make it so that we can do a Last of Us sized project, but we're going to remake. Horizon's getting a remake, trying to do that with every single big game.
I know the market isn't the same as it was, and sorry, I'm a little bit croaky today. I know the market isn't the same as it was 10 years ago, but I think what modern Sony doesn't seem to see, for whatever reason, is that the PS4 success wasn't built on established franchises.
No.
It was built on the likes of Ghosts of Tsushima. It was built on Horizon. It was built on finishing the old guard that they had, like Uncharted, or capitalizing on something that was more or less a next-gen franchise anyway in The Last of Us, or reinventing God of War, or bringing in Spider-Man. You know what I mean? It was like these reinventions and these new ideas, rather than sequels, that got them there in the first place, got them on this outrageous wave that they're riding now of success when it comes to first-party stuff. Because, I mean, at the start of the PS4, no one was championing Sony's first-party stuff, really. You had good games. I liked Killzone Shadowfall. I thought
Infamous Second Son, not too bad.
Infamous Second Son, not too bad. But on the PS3 era, everyone loved Uncharted. Yes, everyone loved The Last of Us, but it was only across the PS4 era that I think the other studios were given the resources and the time and the opportunity to create new IP to get them on that Naughty Dog level, right? And now, over the PS5 era, we've got those franchises established again, and now we're kind of making, not the same mistakes because they're still making money, but they're expecting a Spider-Man 2 or a God of War Ragnarok, which are iterative sequels, to make as much as the original splashes did, where we hadn't seen a Spider-Man game like that before. We hadn't seen a God of War game like that before. Now we have, yet Sony's still expecting the money to go up as I croak to death over here.
Yeah. I think in summary, you have a company looking at a fairly empty slate for the rest of the year. You have so many live service projects that have already been put in motion by the previous president, the previous CEO, and then you have a person who's coming in who seems to be very numbers focused, Hiroki Tsutoki, then visiting those teams, seeing what's in progress, looking at the rest of the financial year until March next year, and just ostensibly, well, then you have the analyst side of it as well, just saying this is going to be a weird year as Sony figures out what the hell they're going to be, and you're also halfway through the current console cycle, which in itself was addled by the fact it was a pandemic machine.
Yeah.
And a lot of us went through a time warp for the first 3 years of the 2020s, if only those 3 years. All that stuff combined puts them in such a different position.
Yeah.
And it's not taken away from, I adore Helldivers too, it's not taken away from the big successes, but it's interesting thinking that they will then look at that. And even by Arrowhead's own admission, the developers of Helldivers 2, they've scrapped the plans they had for the rest of the year, or at least they've notably modified them based on what their CEO is tweeting over on Twitter or X, saying that they've hired up a lot more people because the game is so successful. They can now do a more fleshed out live service version of whatever they were going to do before, but that's how fast they can pivot. And it's interesting thinking about that in regards to an overall brand that is built on stories and cinematic stuff.
I mean, you're absolutely spot on, and I don't want to just repeat what I've said, or
I also don't want to kill your throat
either. Or, nah, I'm fine. I mean, I was so excited to get back, man. I hated being off. But yeah, when it comes to what their roadmap is for the future, my question is when would they be satisfied, and why are you not satisfied with sequels that sell really well, a console that is shifting really well? after we've come out of a pandemic, while, entire countries are still recovering and might not recover for a long time, like to think the market is the same as it was in 2014 and just expect the same results or better, whilst selling a console that realistically doesn't have that many first-party exclusives even going for it. Like, it has great games. I think it's actually come out the gate way better than the PS4 did, but a lot of those games are cross-gen, and until we had Spider-Man 2 last year, we didn't really have a big PS5 exclusive game that wasn't something we already got in the launch window, the first 6 months. And going forward, it's like, well, yeah, you're probably not selling as many consoles as you want because there isn't really a game, and I say this as a huge PlayStation fan, that you look at and you say, I need to buy a PlayStation 5 for that.
Totally.
In the same way that you had a God of War or even an Uncharted 4 back in the day, or Bloodborne. Bring Bloodborne back.
But even that conversation is hung on the idea of cinematics and presentation and graphical fidelity and, oh my God, look at this thing, I need the console, versus are people picking up PlayStation 5s to play Helldivers because their friends are playing it and it's gameplay forward and it's a set of gameplay systems that fundamentally could only be done on new hardware, either because it is a fluid sense of gameplay that is matched together, matchmaking-wise, the connection is really solid, the servers. Is that something the previous generation couldn't have handled? And that's potentially the conversation going forward. Like, we'll see, but it's like for the rest of this year, it's going to be one to keep an eye on all three systems. Yeah. Nintendo, it came out a couple of days ago that they've delayed what was going to be the announcement of the next Switch, and they're ostensibly to be pushing everything back till next year. So even if one of their directs still goes ahead, just to remind people that Nintendo exists or whatever, their next stage is a year away because they don't need to compete with anything. This year is a stopgap.
It is. You're 100% right. I think it's crazy. I'm not a businessman. I barely know what I'm talking about half the time. My voice is croaking. But I just can't fathom that we live in an era right now, despite all of the issues that I've mentioned so far, that we have some Sony first-party studios who are some of the best at what they do, who reliably make money, who work on the biggest franchises in the industry. And if I was in those studios and I was seeing this news come out about how things are disappointing and how things aren't going as well as they could and how 10 billion has been knocked off the market cap, I'd think this isn't sustainable. Like nothing. If that doesn't work, what can work?
Well, and their answer would be a Helldivers 2, a live service, a smaller game, etc. But let us know what you think down in the comments below.